Welcome everyone to tonight's exciting event. My name is Sarah Clark Kaplan, and I have the honor of serving as the new Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center convenes faculty, staff, students, and community members committed to dismantling racism. By forging relationships across American University and with external change makers in the DC region and beyond, ARPC seeks to generate scholarly research, craft educational tools, and disseminate policy analysis that can foster racial justice, advance decolonial politics, and work toward intersectional liberation. At the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, we believe that dismantling racism necessarily requires working in solidarity among uneven and shifting vectors of power and across complex and intersecting identities in difference. And for those reasons, we are honored and thrilled to be able to sponsor tonight's panel. I'd like to start by thanking our co-sponsors for tonight's event: University of Texas Austin Center for Asian American Studies, American University's Office of Campus Life, American University's College of Arts and Sciences, American University's School of Communications, American University's Literature Department, and American University's Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Department. And a special thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences communications staff, who have managed to make the complex technicalities of Zoom once again work for what promises to be a large and robust event tonight. A few notes about tonight's panel before we begin. We are going to have a large audience tonight and a robust panel of speakers that I know we are all eager to hear from. So given this, we are asking folks to use the Q&A function for questions and comments. We may not be able to get to all of those questions during tonight's actual event. However, the moderators and panelists will be engaging them as they prepare this panel for publication as part of a special issue of the Journal of Asian American Studies. Again, those questions and comments should be directed to the Q&A function. However, if you have technical issues or accessibility concerns, and in fact, I've seen some of those crop up already, please use the chat function to contact our hosts and you will get a response. Now, I'd like to introduce the organizers of tonight's event and the moderators for the panel. And I should say that I think we all owe them the greatest thanks for pulling this together. They've worked tirelessly, not only to put together what promises to be an exciting special issue of the Journal of Asian American Studies, but to put together this and what promises to be a series of other exciting and important conversations at the heart of how we rethink Asian American studies and Asian American politics in a moment of, I think, crisis and opportunity. Eric Tang is the director of the Center for Asian American Studies and Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. He's the author of Unsettled: Cambodian Refugees in the New York City Hyperghetto, which came out from Temple University Press in 2015. And he's co-editor of the forthcoming special issue of the Journal of Asian American Studies, Dimensions of Violence, Resistance and Becoming: Asian Americans and the Opening of the COVID Era. Dr. Lily Wong is Associate Professor in the Literature and Critical Race, Gender, and Cultural Studies departments here at American University. She's the author of Trans-Pacific Attachments, Sex Work, Media Networks, and Affective Histories of Chineseness, which came out of Columbia University Press in 2018. And she is the other co-editor of this exciting forthcoming special issue of JAAS, Dimensions of Violence, Resistance and Becoming: Asian Americans in the Opening of the COVID Era. And with no further ado, I will introduce Lily Wong to kick off the moderation of this panel and to introduce our panelists. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone who is joining us on Zoom. It is a pleasure for you all to host you all today. It's been a year of tremendous violence and loss. For many Asian Americans, the pandemic both reinforced and disoriented our racial location. The anti-Asian violence during the pandemic has forced many of us to question how we're truly viewed, who will stand with us, but also how we stand with others. What does racial solidarity mean right now? The practice of showing up, of making our presence meaningful, is no simple matter. Beyond statements and hashtags, how do we actively and creatively practice solidarity through our activism, our art, redirecting material resources, and the narratives we shape? This panel of artists, activists, writers, and scholars who have been advancing our collective thinking on the current racial and gendered locations of Asian America will discuss the remaking of Asian American presence and solidarity in this crucial moment in US history. On the panel, we have Jeff Chang, the author of 4 books, including most recently, Who We Be, A Cultural History of Race in Post-Civil Rights America, and We Gon' Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation. Co-founder of Culture Strike and Color Lines, Jeff has been a USA Ford Fellow in Literature, a winner of the Asian American Literary Award, and was named the Frederick Douglass 200. Also on the panel is Donlian Gardner, who has left an indelible mark on viewers as Charlie Baudelaire in the critically acclaimed show Queen Sugar. A writer as well as an actor, her creative work has long intersected with her advocacy, ranging from racial justice and immigrant rights to gender equity and climate justice. Donlian is also the founder of the Belong campaign and a proud member of social justice collective Harness. Kathy Park Hong is the author of Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. She is also the author of poetry collections, including Engine Empire and Dance Dance Revolution. Hong is the recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. She is the poetry editor of The New Republic and is a full professor at Rutgers Newark University. Jay Caspian Kong is staff writer for New York Times Opinion and the New York Times Magazine and author of upcoming book, The Loneliest Americans. And Nancy Wang Yuan is a sociologist and author of Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism, and co-author of The Prevalence and Portrayal of Asian and Pacific Islanders across 1,300 popular films. She has appeared on PBS, NPR, and BBC World. She's a guest writer at CNN, NBC, Newsweek, Elle, and Self. Nancy is currently writing a book about her life through the films and television shows she grew up watching. We welcome our panelists, and I'll hand things off to Eric with our first question.
Thank you, Lily. And good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining us. Before we begin, just another shout for my co-moderator and co-organizer and co-conspirator, Lily Wang, who's just done a remarkable job in pulling all of this together. So thank you, Lily. So to begin, this term presence has come up quite a bit. And what we mean by presence is the way that Asian Americans over this past year and a half are at once invisible, as they historically are, and then hypervisible during this pandemic. And when I talk to other Asian Americans about that contradiction or that paradox, a lot of them say, we really don't know what's happening to us right now. You know, how do we go from being invisible to hypervisible in this way? And it's such a huge question. And when I find that I'm confronted with these huge questions, I usually go to the people I look up to for answers. And so we're going to begin with a person who I've looked up to for years, and that is Jeff Chang. Jeff, how do you understand what's happening to Asian Americans right now?
Thanks, Eric. And actually, that should go back to you, man, people that I look up to. So thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, all my amazing co-panelists. It's such an honor to be able to be here. So, you know, when I think about this question of invisibility and hypervisibility in this moment, I'm thinking a lot about you know, how Asians and Pacific Islanders have historically gone unseen and unrecognized. And certainly in this moment, we can think about healthcare workers, we can think about frontline workers, paramedics, nurses, food workers, the people who put the things on our doorsteps, right? And all of these folks, how they've been so disproportionately and deeply impacted by COVID and the economic crisis. Um, and so that's, historically kind of what we've been used to. And then we can think, of course, of these instances of targeted violence that have been on the rise, especially against women, and and also especially the spectacular instances of violence against elderly in our cities. So how do we deal, right, with these diverging vectors of violence, right? That done to those who are unseen and unrecognized, most of us, and that done to those of us who are now suddenly seen, suddenly targeted. So that's I think the question, right, that we're facing in this time. But we can also kind of add another layer to that, and I want to try to do that here as well, which is to say that we're in a historic moment in this nation's history. There's a fight underway for the soul of America, and it's about either continuing to prop up the status quo that centers white supremacy, or figuring out a way to change that. Um, and in the last 8 years, I want to say the Black freedom struggle has really put before all of us with more urgency than ever this possibility of imagining a post white supremacist America. And there's a desire for this, right? There's 25 million people in the streets who have affirmed this, including many of us Asians and Pacific Islanders. So as we think about these dual violences that are being done to us, we also are thinking, we're going through our own reckoning, thinking about where we stand in relationship to power, to privilege, to oppression, and how do we choose to act, right, in a system that places Asians and Pacific Islanders between Black and white. And so we have to confront the fact that the Black freedom struggle is not a metaphor for our liberation, right? It's about real people, it's about real lives. And we have to articulate individually and collectively what our relationship to freedom is. And a freedom that maybe doesn't always and shouldn't always put ourselves first, and what freedom for all really means. So I just wanted to throw that out as well. And the last thing maybe to say is this, right? We've been fighting for years for visibility, but I want to pose the question for us, all of us here, right? Visibility for what? To be seen, certainly to be recognized, to be welcomed as human, to be alleviated of our suffering. But for what? What if we do become visible? What if we are seen? What happens then? And I'm not asking why, right? I'm asking for what? What does it look like if we win? What does it look like for everyone if we win? I just wanted to throw those questions out there to start.
I believe Eric has a follow-up question. Go for it.
So Jeff, thank you for that sweeping introduction. One thing that you said in passing, and maybe it wasn't in passing, but it's maybe a central part of what you're saying, is that we're living in this moment in which white supremacy is no longer something that we can talk about as anomalous, as marginal, but central. And yet what I find to be interesting about the past year and a half, where Asian Americans and anti-Asian violence is on the rise and white supremacy is on the rise, is that the two are never joined in discussion. There doesn't seem to be a real link in the public discourse between what's happening to Asian Americans and the clear articulations of white supremacy. And I'm wondering if you could hit a little bit on why that is, or if you agree with me that that hasn't been the case. And I think just of Biden's speech, in which he talks about the two as wholly separate, right, on his 100th day in office. If you have any thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Sorry, I was muted. Maybe just some to start, because I really want to hear what everybody else has to say. But that feels of a piece with the desire to kind of deny this sort of almost knee-jerk denial in the wake of the Atlanta massacre and the Indianapolis massacre, to separate these particular horrifying acts of violence from white supremacy and the history and legacy of white supremacy as it's been visited upon Asians, South Asians and East Asians. And so, that I think is part and parcel about what it is that we are, those of us who considers ourselves a part of Asian America, of Asians and Pacific Islanders in America, in the US, in this particular moment. That's part of our reckoning in this point. What do we say? How do we react? What do we do? Where do we move in this? And in that respect, for us, this is a moment that's as important as, the murder and the aftermath of Vincent Chin, 1982 was. It's something that's happening across all of our communities and that we're all talking about. And I'm really excited to hear about what everybody else has to think about this and say about this.
Thank you, Jeff. And this perhaps connects to my question for Kathy, actually. And so Jeff, you brought up Atlanta. So in many ways, Asian American invisibility and hypervisibility, the duality of it, we've actually seen in the violence in Atlanta last spring as also highly gendered and sexualized. So in your recent book, Kathy, Minor Feelings, you ruminate on the violent death of artist and poet Teresa Ha-King Cha. Why was it important for you to write about her? How might your reflections on her life and death give us some language to grapple with our current moment in the wake of the murders in Atlanta and also the tremendous loss of life during a pandemic?
Thank you for that question. And thank you, by the way, everyone, Eric and Lily, and the panelists for inviting me. I'm very honored. Teresa Ha-King Cha was a huge influence on my life as a poet and artist. And I was introduced to her in college. And not only was I introduced to her, I was introduced to her by this other poet, Youngmi Kim. So there was this kind of direct Korean American female lineage that was built. And that kind of passing down of influences was absolutely instrumental to my identity as a creator, that I had a right to it, a permission to it. And not only that, that I had predecessors before me who not only wrote about their stories, but were innovators, avant-gardists who didn't refuse the containers that they were placed in. And so I think that gave me a lot of the kind of empowerment and boldness that I needed to A, be a writer, and B, write the kind of weird shit that I like to write. This probably applies more to my poetry. At the time, in thinking about Teresa Ha-King Cha, I didn't want to write about her rape and murder, but I was, writing a review and I was looking at her bibliography, and it really disturbed me that there was this complete erasure of her rape. She was just murdered, and that was it. And, among academic circles, there's always been this huge sort of like church and state separation between author's biography and the author's life and the writing. It's a new critical or postmodern way of looking at it. And so that was, I sort of reasoned that was why scholars didn't touch Teresa Ha-King Cha's life. But after a while, the erasure was so loud that it occurred to me that the persistent silence around her death and her rape wasn't just this kind of orthodoxy, this academic orthodoxy, but a repression that seemed almost uncomfortably close to or even mirroring of the overall silencing of sexual violence against Asian women in Asia and in America that is imposed by whiteness, colonialism, and patriarchy. Now, I think like just overall among Asian Americans, there's a tendency to minimize our traumas, minimize our histories as colonized subjects from sort of the more progressive younger generation of Asians who think the racism they face isn't major enough to talk about, and they're taking space away from other Black and Indigenous people, to Asian immigrants who have been accustomed to thinking that the racist harassment they face is just part of living in America and there's nothing to be done about it but endure it. And in the scope of what happened in Atlanta and how it ties to what happened to Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha and the sexual violence that women encounter and the physical violence, we have to talk about it. We have to confront it. We have to amplify it. So first of all, so that the violence isn't reproduced, so that it is stopped. And also, not only is it assault upon our female bodies, but it's also an assault upon our mental health as well in the way these assault is minimized. In terms of Atlanta, I've been telling everyone to read Grace M. Cho's Tastes Like War, which is a devastating and brilliant memoir about her schizophrenic mother, who was a prostitute in one of the camp towns in Korea. And that book gives a lot of context and background to what happened to Atlanta. And what I grieve for in Atlanta is the murder of these Asian female immigrants, but also how we'll never know about their lives and the kind of privations they face trying to get by, and that we live in a country where we have to use GoFundMe to financially support their families. And trying to understand the sexual violence against women and fetishization of their bodies, you have to talk about colonialism, you have to talk about the wars abroad, you have to talk about the American occupation, in particular to these women, because they weren't just any sex workers, they worked in massage parlors. And immediately when I heard what happened, I thought of the massage parlors in Korea with the double barber poles that serve as men, and a lot of times the American military. And what Grace M. Cho talks about is that during the Korean War, everyone was living in poverty, and many women were forced into prostitution, which was legal, but only legal for the American military stationed there. And basically, Korean government was a pimp, which also generated a lot of revenue for the country. And then these massage parlors were imported to the States, like the parlors in Atlanta. But what was also imported were these orientalized, sexualized, debased images of Asian women that that come from camp towns, not only in Korea, but in the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, and so forth. These women, quote unquote, service men who are dragon lady madams, exotic, fetishized, and all of that have been popularized in Hollywood and shaped the American perception of Asian American women today. And so when we talk about how we don't talk about white supremacy and Asian Americans and so forth, I always say that you have to, it's like when we talk about Asian American history, it has to precede us actually coming to this country to the root of imperialism. You can't talk about the Atlanta massacre, and you can't talk about the fetishization of Asian American women or Asian women without the genocidal violence that happened globally, and it's all just an entangled knot of race, labor, and gender and colonialism. So that's how much I can squeeze in. There you go.
Thank you, Kathy. And I believe Nancy has a follow-up, also a reflection in regards to Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so also honored to be here with everyone. And I just, in the wake of Atlanta, I was just shocked at how this country really treated Asian women fetishization as not a hate crime and not as racism. And I realized that we had to really explain how sexism and racism, it can't be taken apart, right, when it comes to how Asian women are treated in this country. And a lot of academics, a lot of ethnic studies professors, went on kind of this crusade to really educate the United States about how your objectification of Asian women is actually a form of racism, right? And so I agree with everything that Kathy talked about, and also, but even in the United States, the Page Act, there's codified even into our laws, right? In terms of the Page Act not letting Chinese women come and framing them all as prostitutes. And so there is a history both in terms of our occupation abroad, but also our perceptions of immigrants coming. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much. And this actually ties in perhaps to my question to Don Lian, right? In terms of kind of the events recently have just been so kind of personal and visceral, also tied to histories, but also tied to various positionalities. My question to you, Don Lian, how are you grappling with this moment of kind of double invisibility and hypervisibility through your own work as an artist and activist and through the various positionalities that you perform and embody?
Wow. Just to the question. I had this question in advance and I've been looking at it every single day. And just every day, I feel like I have a different response to it. So I will first name that today's response is today's response. I also just want to thank everyone for the invitation to be here. It is such an honor, and I could literally sit here and listen to all of you speak for probably days or weeks. So just thank you for having me. I also want to name that I'm coming into this conversation and my response is coming from a few different lenses. And one of them is an artist and specifically an actor with a certain amount of public facing persona and space. And so this question about visibility, invisibility, hypervisibility is an interesting, I feel myself answering from like 5 different positions at the same time. So I'll try to tease those out. First of all, the visibility, just even that word visibility, for me to even be in this space and having this conversation or to be participating in this conversation is already an interesting moment of visibility in the Asian space. Because for most folks, my Asianness, my relationship to Asian identity is not visible. It's not a visible thing. It's something that I actually have to, make folks aware of if they're curious or if it's relevant or because I want to or whatever it is. And so that's just a dance that I've danced my whole life, and that comes to bear in a very interesting way at this time, in this moment. So as I talk, I can feel, for those who don't know, my mom is Chinese, my dad's Black, and I can feel those 2 parts of me, those 2 identities of me just having a conversation. So I'm trying to catch up to the conversation and translate it as quickly as possible as I sit here. But another way this is like the visibility conversation is really interesting is as an actor, and as an actor in, I don't like this word, but in a position of celebrity in some way, or a position of at least public space, because there is a built-in visibility to that. And in my, I guess, the last 4 to 5 years, I have learned to build a relationship with that kind of visibility, and that visibility not necessarily embracing or being a welcome space to me wanting to unpack it and unpack those identities. So I've had to carve out and create spaces where I can do that and do that safely, because I do feel that it's critical that people who are in those visible spaces talk about that experience, because so much of media has to do with, or rather the question we're answering has a relationship to how media has participated in the, image making, representation, hypersexualization, et cetera, of Asians and Asian women especially. And so I'm like deeply aware of it in this moment, just how much that part of my world is at play in this answer. But I will get sort of to the invisibility, hypervisibility in both my cultural experience and also my experience as an artist. I'm going to say that last year, right when the protests were in full bloom, is when I learned a story about my family that I hadn't heard before. And it was because the protests were in full bloom that my cousins, my mom's cousins, were letting me know information about our history. And this is that story. My grandmother's father, my great-grandfather, was born here, right? That was around the turn of the century. He fought in World War I at 17, as a teenager. He then, because of the Exclusion Act, he went back to China and married, because they were like, we're not going to let women in who are not prostitutes, right, from China. Back to China, married, had 3 kids, came back to the States. Family couldn't come. Then fought in World War II, re-enlisted at 42 or so, fought in World War II, and was killed 2 years into the war in America, in the Bay Area in uniform in what was believed to be a hate crime. So that made me, because of that, my mom was born in China, right? And she was an immigrant. And so I'm the daughter of an immigrant, but I'm also 4th generation Chinese in this country. And that kind of story is nowhere in our media. It's nowhere in our history books. It's not embraced as American history. But for me, the fact that I didn't know it until I was 39 years of age, right? The fact that I had heard whispers, but never anything solid of, we think that there was something that was weird about his death. There was a railroad track involved. I mean, really, right? The fact that I had never tracked it and that I didn't have that until someone in our family really went after this story and found it out. And it came up during the protests of last year, which were about Black lives. So that's the intersection that I occupy. And for me, learning that history, it was such a profound, like, that's one of the most pithy stories of the relationship between labor, race, white supremacy, Black folks, and our time right now. And so for me, that's what I find myself grappling with, is the invisibility of, that's been forced a bit, the invisibility that's also somewhat baked into our cultural norms across Asian experience, but also the invisibility that comes from stories that we don't even know are a part of our history, that inform our own no one spelled that out, but yeah, I think I probably picked up reasons that my family members are more reserved and that they were taught to be, right? The reality of how bloody the history is when it comes to Asian American experience in this country, and how erased that's been, how completely unknown that reality has been, and how much it's affected all of us unconsciously. So for me, as I sit here and talk about this, my Black identity is going, So the more that you get in touch with that history, the more that you insist on those stories being centered in your media and unapologetically culturally centered, where your lens is uncompromised as normal, and your cultural lens is uncompromised as normal, that's you honoring your ancestors and honoring the reality of what the demand of this moment is. For me, the demand is to be uncompromisingly present with all of how complicated it has been, and it has not been allowed to be. And for me, that is the ask that I find myself seeking to answer in my work across domains, but in particular in my work as an artist and in my work as someone in a public facing position, to insist on having the conversation and insisting on its complexity and its nuance and its visibility.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that story. That was very generous of you, Don Lian. And this perhaps ties into my question for Nancy, this kind of vexed but also complicated and need to be nuanced question about visibility. I want to bring to you as a scholar that studies visibility, that studies the visual medium, specifically the film industry, right? What do you make of this recent rise of Asian American visibility in Hollywood? Here I'm thinking about Nomadland, Minari, The Farewell, Half of It, Queen Sugar, Never Have I Ever, The Chair, and just this last weekend, Shang-Chi. What might be the possibility and or limitations of representation at this historical juncture, kind of thinking across what Don Lian just shared too, in terms of the kind of potentials, but also the complexities of visibility and taking up public narratives?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Don Lian, for sharing that story. And I think that story, the fact that we haven't heard that story, we haven't seen that story, is very much an example of the narrative scarcity Asian Americans experience. This is to quote Viet Thanh Nguyen, the scholar novelist. We just don't have all those stories, even as we are having a lot more stories, right, than before, because it was from like when I was growing up, it was like invisible, talk about invisibility. And so even this last year, right, we had two, not just one, but two Asian men nominated for Best Actor, along with Chadwick Boseman. So 3 men of color out of 5 was like, whoa, actually a majority of nominees. But of course, none of them won. And that was a shocker. I think most of us expected Chadwick Boseman to win. And so I think that, and Chloe Zhao became the first woman of color to ever win Best Director. And of course, like we talked about, like Lily just mentioned, Shang-Chi, right? Shang-Chi's out, the first Asian American superhero to ever headline a Marvel film. And so it feels like our moment has arisen, but there's still so many missing stories, especially when we're not seeing stories of Southeast Asians, really. We still aren't seeing the full diversity of our community. And certainly not, we haven't even gone into, mixed families, right? And we know actually mixed race kids are a huge part of the Asian American experience. And so that story hasn't been really touched on enough as well. And in my recent research with USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, we found that actually when you look at the leads in films, there's really, so out of 1,300 top films from 2007 to 2019, we had only 29 Asian American leads. And so that's 2.2%, which isn't even, we're about triple that in our population. So we're not even making population parity in terms of prominent roles, right? So sure, we're making a lot of progress, but if we step back and look at the kind of the quantitative data, we aren't there yet.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor to Eric to ask our next set of questions in terms of solidarity.
So thank you for those responses around, representation and the stories that are told or not told. And why I find Don Lian's family history so haunting is because it's that which is not just untold, but won't be represented. If you catch my drift. And what I mean by that is that there's no room for us to even frame a story like that. We don't even have the frames of reference. And so when a story like that comes out, it quickly gets, swept aside because people don't know what to do with it. In addition to, just your garden variety racism of not wanting to know about Asian immigrants who fought in World War I or World War II. And this brings me to the question of solidarity, because so much of, whether or not we are in solidarity with each other as Asians and as African Americans, if we show up for each other, is based on, the stories that we're familiar with and those that we can handle. And so, for instance, when we talk about Asian American and Black solidarity, we often bring up the same people time and again: Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, because these are narratives that work for us. They make sense. These are people who came up during, the Black freedom movement, and as Asian Americans, they found identity within it. So, okay, we have now a story of solidarity. But my question, and this is a question for Jeff, what if, we weren't allowed to say Grace Lee Boggs or Yuri Kochiyama? What if we couldn't say Third World Liberation Front? What would we be left with by way of a conversation about, Asian American and African American solidarity? Right? Or is it just the case that because these stories aren't being told, these alliances are just less tenable right now? They're more the very rare exception than the rule.
Well, maybe the first point to make, just to connect it back to what Nancy was talking about, is we still haven't seen Grace Lee Boggs, on the big screen. But for Grace Lee's amazing documentary, right, American Revolutionary, we still haven't seen, Yuri Kochiyama on the big screen, in that kind of way. So in terms of visibility in the story, the visibility of those stories to those of us who, like the rest of my family, who didn't get an Asian American Studies degree, I'd still have to explain to them who Yuri Kochiyama is, and Grace Lee Boggs, and I think they get with it, right? I just don't know that that's necessarily a story that's as common as Johnny Appleseed's story, you know what I mean, or something like that. I just wanted to kind of make that point, but it's a really interesting kind of question that you raised, because it does fundamentally get to the question of, like, what are we constituting? What are we constituting an Asian American identity for? What are we constituting an Asian and Pacific Islander in America kind of identity for, right? In relationship to whom, and for what? Which is something that has just been obsessing me of late. I've been thinking about this a lot. Um, and I guess, one of the standing points that we can kind of go back to is, going back to Yuji Ichioka and Emma G and the generation of young college students who in the 60s, as an act of solidarity, right, began to describe uh, this emergent sort of thing as Asian American identity, right? They kind of invented Asian America. That acts of solidarity are always social constructions, right? It's obvious, but it's something that we kind of have to come back around to all the time, and to come back to this notion that Linda Sarsour always raises, which is that she thinks of solidarity as a verb, right? As something that is done. Like in this moment, we are asking other communities to stand with us, right? We're asking other communities to help us protect ourselves and our elderly, right? Um, we have to show up as well, right? And not in a transactional kind of way, but because mutuality is something that we value. And so I've been thinking a lot actually in this moment about what solidarity means as a practice. And I was really moved. And this, I just want to hear from Jay, but to shout out the New York Times Magazine and the work that Jay's been doing. And Jay Ali did a cover story recently on the Ratanapakdi family in San Francisco. Visha Ratanapakdi, who's killing by a suspect who is a young black man, just sort of shocked the Bay Area. And what I think Jia does in that article is she humanizes this really deep and often lonely struggle that families will go through after a horrific act of violence, and to see if it's possible to actually even humanize the person who has committed this horrible act, if there's a possibility of redemption. And so it makes me think that in some ways, like that's the practice of solidarity, right? Is restorative justice, which is work that you've done, Eric, in communities for years and years and years, and have inspired me. And it's so hard to do. It's so hard to imagine, but it feels like the work that we have to do: how to mend, how to heal, how to build together. And that leads us to this notion of, if we can imagine a country, communities, societies, right, in which we can live together, right, that's different from a system of domination and extraction and white supremacy. So yeah, I'll just stop there. I want to shut up and listen to Jay.
And so this does lead to a question for Jay, based on an op-ed that Jay, you wrote last spring, titled "We Need to Put a Name to This Violence," which tackles this question of solidarity or Black-Asian relations. I'd like to know what prompted you to write that piece. What is this anti-Asian violence that hasn't been named? Is it interracial violence? Because there are those in Asian American studies, my field, who'd say that violence between people of color is always in some ways mediated by white racism, by white supremacy, even when white people aren't involved. Your op-ed seems to suggest that this analysis is a bit too simplistic. And if I can quote from your piece, you say, quote, "There's an opportunity to reshape that language to address the contradictions inherent in the lives of millions of immigrants and to create a reality that acknowledges the size of the rift between Asian and Black Americans, but does not fall into a zero-sum game in which everyone loses, end quote. How would you reshape that language?
First, I want to say, that I'm glad to be here, and it's an honor, and a lot of people I look up to. The way that I think Kathy felt about Teresa Hawk Kyung Cha, I sometimes feel about Jeff, because he was out there writing stuff that I was just like, I can't believe that somebody's writing this stuff. So it's an honor for that reason alone. So to answer your question, I think that some of the reason why I wrote the piece was because it just felt like there was some sort of reticence for a lot of people to discuss what had happened in the Bay Area specifically, which was that you have these high profile incidents that are on video that go super viral, where the person who was attacking the person is Black and the victim is Asian, and that this has a huge effect because people really process violence through watching these videos now online, and that I think, for a lot of people who are new immigrants, or who are recent immigrants, and those are the people who I was most concerned about here in the Bay Area, that, narrative starts to take hold, and that this is not a new narrative here. I mean, when I've lived in the Bay Area on and off for about 15 years, and 10 years ago when I first left, I remember that was also the conversation that was happening. There were a couple high profile incidents. Somebody got shoved off a Muni track, another attack. And they're all, if you look back at the newspapers, there's all sorts of newspaper articles saying the exact same thing that they were saying 10 years later. And so I felt like I felt the need to write something that, tried to make a couple arguments. The first was that I think that sometimes when the people who are in charge of making these sorts of narratives, which I think are people like the people on this panel, I think they sometimes undersell the actual gap between Asian communities and Black communities. I think they undersell the amount of distance there is between communication between those two communities. And I do think that it is laundered in many ways through Third World Liberation Front, through Yuri Kochiyama, through Grace Lee Boggs. And so I wanted to express that. I wanted to say that those three names don't mean anything to me. I'm 41 years old. I grew up here in the United States. They certainly don't mean anything to my parents who immigrated from Korea in 1979. And that if the discourse around, if the proof of the possibility of solidarity is stuff that happened 40, 50 years ago, then we need to come up with a different type of language to figure out what solidarity could be going forward. And so for me, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I think that basically what needs to happen, the new language of solidarity has to not be one that's sort of processed through terms like, I don't know, like you said, Eric, this idea that things are sort of routed back through white supremacy. I totally agree with that, right? I think that's true. I think that's a very difficult thing to sell to people who are walking up and down Chinatown in Oakland right now. I don't think that if you say this is all just about white supremacy, I don't think that's going to be a particularly effective way to talk about it. And so for me, I think that solidarity has to come when people see a shared struggle. I think that for Asian Americans for the past 10 years or so, maybe 20 years, that perhaps the main focus of political activism has been has been self-serving for the upwardly mobile, upper middle class Asian Americans who, I don't mean any offense to anybody here, but, talk about Hollywood representation, things like that. I don't think that is a good form of politics to build solidarity through, because in the end, you're just like, well, we didn't get some acting roles. Just like, well, I personally don't care about that. I don't know many people who really care about that. And so what do we have then? What do we have that would bind Asian Americans together? We have a large working class immigrant population. I think that if we focus our politics on that population, people who are not talked about, Southeast Asians, for example, Cambodians here in the Bay Area, people who are actually not wealthy, people who are poor, who are caught up in the criminal justice system, then natural pathways of solidarity will open up between Asian Americans and other people who are also involved in that type of work. But if you go to these activist spaces, it's very difficult because you have some people who are involved in that type of work, and they want to make connections with other people who are involved in that type of work. And if the focus of your political activism is something that about like, you know, corporate microaggressions or something like that, there's no actual overlap. Solidarity is impossible. And so, yes, that's my spiel. Sorry. I think that there just needs to be a refocusing of it. And I think that the attacks, but I agree with everybody here that this is a time of redefinition. And, you know, I think that is the way that it should be redefined. Like along with, you know, real examination, I think of what Kathy was talking about, which is like, you know, what are some of the issues in terms of Asian women specifically that we can discuss that are outside of the way in which we have sort of conceptualized Asian American as a personhood, and how do we draw those lines back to imperialism? Like, I think those are the conversations that need to happen, not sort of mythologizing of the Third World Liberation Front.
Thank you, Jay. And I believe Don Lian has a follow-up to this question about solidarity.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so interesting to get into this part of the conversation, right, which is pretty specific. And I find myself like, well, here I am, right there at that nexus. And what I want to just name, and first of all, thank Jay for, is naming basic discomfort. Like basic, it's extremely, incredibly uncomfortable. There's no guidance around navigating that discomfort. There's barely any permission to have it or name it. And in my experience of Asian culture, specifically Chinese culture, discomfort is not the goal. That's just it's a hard thing to deal with, because culturally there aren't a lot of, there's not a lot in place to just deal with that kind of discomfort. So I just want to thank you, Jay, for naming it. But I also want to say that I think one question I've been sitting with all year now has to do with the goal. Like, what's the goal? What's our goal? And I think that's not always given enough space to unpack how differently people may actually be responding to that question, how different that might actually be expressing itself for people. I think because of my work and because of where I both am and have chosen to be in terms of how I'm positioned and my identities, I tend to assume that the goal is solidarity. And when I say in solidarity, look up solidarity, I come across the word union. And I come across like, okay, so that's pointing in an arrow of togetherness. It's pointing in an arrow of shared interest and shared. But I also think the goal is not just that, not dry, but just that like easy to name. I think the goal lives somewhere, which is why I'm an artist and not an academic, but I think the goal lives somewhere in a more amorphous and ambiguous place too. And that somewhere has to do, for me, with healing. It has to do with like, it's not just confronting, it's not just political wins, it's not just, telling the truth about this incredibly large gap in my experience between these two communities, which is offset by my family experience, which is where that gap totally shrinks. And it's just what my experience is. But it does have to do with something else that's harder to name, that isn't as, it's harder to quantify, it's harder to like, to easily and comfortably contain. And I think that willingness to be uncomfortable and to stay in the room, no matter how uncomfortable we all get, and to center for ourselves what the goal is really critical to being able to embrace what Jay's putting forth, which is, this is, at least this is what I'm hearing, this is a more complicated question than we're giving it credit for, and it deserves redefinition, and courageous redefinition, even if it's a messy process, because without it, we probably won't move it forward, and things won't stop. People won't be safe or free or whole. So I just wanted to offer that from my perspective as someone who's like, I sit at that conversation and I go, okay, I know what I've seen in my communities. I know what I've seen at the Chinese grocery store. I know what I've seen at, I know what I've seen growing up and how difficult it is for me to even hold it, who's holding both. And it's hard for me to ask my Chinese elders or elders in the community. It's hard for me to even go there with like, how are they supposed to talk about anti-Blackness? And like, what? So I think that's a part of the equation that doesn't get named is something that lives in like a more heartful space. And it's not the sexy part of the conversation. It's not the academically impressive part of the conversation, but I think it's a necessary part of the conversation.
Thank you, Don Leanne. And I believe Kathy has also a follow-up.
There's so much I want to say. There's so many great points that have been made. I want to respond to what Jeff, Don, Jay were saying, and also to Eric's initial point. I think there's a lot of discomfort, to use your word, Don, right now, because I agree with Jeff that we are at this crisis point where the tectonic plates are shifting, and we're at this sort of breaking point, and we are kind of, and Asian Americans are kind of negotiating what belonging means in this country, and in a country has been so acclimated to this bipolarized rhetoric of black and white, capitalists and communists and so forth. That kind of rhetoric doesn't work anymore. What are we going to use? What are we going to do? How do we build intra-racial solidarity? And what is that solidarity for in the wake of climate change and neoliberalism and all of that? So I think there's there's so much at stake, and it's easy to feel either cynical or lost and so forth. But going back to what Eric was saying, I don't think we should throw out Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs and the Third World Liberation Front as overused historical figures that doesn't have no relevance to, or not no relevance, but don't really relate to what's happening now, because I agree, there's I mean, if we studied Asian American studies, especially during a certain period in this country, in this time period, then we know, but a lot of Asian Americans don't. I found out embarrassingly late, not while I was in high school, certainly not even while I was in college. And in the way that in African American history, people always learn about Frederick Douglass or Baldwin or Martin Luther King. Like, we need to have these historical Asian American icons hammered, even though if we get sick of it, we have to have these models, because every generation forgets. And we're always having this, the kind of white supremacist history that is always trying to kind of erase that and sanitize that, as we are saying with the whole trumped up, stupid critical race theory controversy happening. So I just don't think we should take that for granted, those historical moments for granted. Secondly, what I think we need to do is really emphasize the intro, what I'm missing or what I'm not seeing in books, in movies or anything, is stories like Don's story, stories of interracial solidarity, and how communities get along between each other. I don't think, like, as an example is in, if we're talking about intraracial community and how people get along with each other, look at the working class then. Look at the relationship between the Hmong community and the Black community in Minnesota. That is a very complicated, that's a very complicated community, because the Hmong community is living in the same kind of poverty as Black Americans, And they're also kind of growing up in the projects in the same way, going to the same schools, have faced police brutality too. We focus on, and this is where I think this Asian American sort of narrative, model minority myth or white adjacency doesn't work. We looked at that Hmong cop and we thought, oh, he is, you know, he's white adjacent, blah, blah, blah. It's more complicated than that. He's Hmong, you know, he was working class like everyone else there, and they were of the same community. They were of the same community, but there was also a lot of complexity to that. And I think we need to, if we're talking about interracial solidarity, I think going to these urban communities, city communities, and looking at really bringing out these stories would also help us think about or rethink racial narratives that's not so segregated. One last thing I want to bring up is that in the wake of the 2020 elections and how we go forward, myths are important because people don't have time to talk about the complexities of whatever issue that we're being heard about at hand. And I think especially with disinformation. And right now, and this is why I do think history matters, how we came here before. And this is not, maybe I'm talking less about fourth generation Chinese Americans, but more about first and second generation immigrants who are here. And, you know, more and more, you know, when immigrants are here, they don't think of themselves as American. They think of themselves also as Cambodian or, you know, or Thai or Taiwanese. And a lot of their ties are to their former country. And a lot of that sort of, you know, what they believe in or what they kind of, a lot of the colonial sensibility is still very much an anti-communist sensibility that makes them vote against their own interests. And so this is why I think, I don't know, I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think that it's important to, when we're thinking about, it's not just, it is class, yes, but there is a way that media detracts people from thinking about class and what people and the shared commonalities of class, and think, oh, wait, you know what? If you want universal health care, that's communist, you know? And so this is why you have to kind of go back to why immigrants ended up here in the first place. What are the kinds of immigrants who ended up in their first place, whether they're working class or upper middle class? Sorry, that was
just to respond. I mean, I don't think that, you know, I think it's totally fine to teach Third World Liberation Front and Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs in an Asian American Studies class. Like, I think that what is the problem is that the process that you talked about, which is like a deep look into the Hmong community, for example, and the relationship with Black Americans in Minneapolis, that is something that is not done, you know, that is not something, I think when Suni Lee I thought that maybe there would be some stuff then, but there's not, you know, the sort of response to Tu Tao, who was the cop who was standing by when George Floyd died, was just sort of like you know, from people who are like us, who are sort of like the people who shape opinions within Asian America, was just sort of like aghast, right? Like, oh my God, you know, like, and a disavowal of Tu Tao, right? Which is what happens all the time when somebody who is not East Asian messes up, right? Like, it's sort of like this, like almost like this form of like, oh, well, you're not really part of like one of us type of thing, you know? And so I think that really does, if you want to look at that, then you should look at the relationship between Korean working class people in the 90s and the 80s and the Black population in those areas. Now, what happens is that when those types of difficult questions get broached, there is a defensive posture that is taken in which Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, and the Third World Liberation Front fill in as a type of example of solidarity, that solidarity was possible at one time in the radical 60s and 70s, right? And that this proves that this is possible. Like, why is there no other example other than Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, and there's been 50 years since the 50 years since the or 40 something, what is it? It's 50 years since the it's like down the street from me where the house where they did AAPA, right? Like I walk by it a lot. I think about this a lot. It's just like it's a really long time ago. You know, there's no other examples of it. And if there were, they would be promoted, right? But they're not. And so I think that it's not that we shouldn't talk about those examples. It's that they're doing a type of, I think that they are sort of soft pedaling and that they're being used in a way to actually discourage people from talking about the actual gaps between these populations and some of the problems between the populations. Like, and they are myths, I think, at this point. Like AAPA, the way that it is described completely erases everything that happened with the Filipino people organizing at San Francisco State. It becomes a Berkeley story among East Asians, right? It's the more prestigious university that gets the credit. It's the East Asians instead of the Filipinos who get the credit, right? Everything about the International Hotel is sort of reduced to like IWK, right? It's not about the Filipino organizers there. Like this is the type of stuff that happens all the time. Like I just don't buy the myth. I'm sorry. Like and I don't think it should be used in that sort of way. It's okay to teach it. I just don't think that we should keep talking about it. And whenever one of these instances came up, like I play this game with my friend. This is the last thing I'll say, but I play this game with my friends where I would send articles that would come out after the Atlanta shooting, and I was like, "What paragraph will they mention the Third World Liberation Front?" You know, and we would bet on it. Like that's how rote of a response it's become.
Thank you, Jay. I think Jeff
Oh,
has a
sorry,
follow-up.
I didn't mean to.
Jeff, come on in.
Wow, where do we start?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear you, Jay, on that. I mean, I was more I was more trying to check for what Andrew Sullivan was talking about in terms of gaslighting Asian Americans about whether racism was involved in this or not, and him arguing
Yeah.
it wasn't, right? I mean, for me, you know, I everything that uh, that shapes my way of thinking comes from um, stories of how of from when I grew up. Um, and that, Don, your story profoundly moved me because it's similar to stories from my family, remigration. You know, on my dad's side, I could be fourth generation, but I could also be second. You know what I mean? My third, our third. Uh, yeah, it's like there's remigration happening. It's transnational, right? Asian America is just not even Asian America. It's
Mhm.
it's it's much bigger than that. And so it's easier for me to use Asians and Pacific Islanders in America or in the U.S. than it is to talk about Asian America sometimes. But myths matter, right? The spate of videos and the circulation that they have around violence, street violence between young black men and elderly Chinese, right? That is sort of reifying a sort of myth about violence and the way that it occurs between communities as well. If we look at the data, overwhelmingly, the perpetrators of violence against Asian Americans are white males, like 80%, 90%, right? That's what the numbers show. And so myths matter and narratives matter and culture matters in all those kinds of ways. Representation matters in all those kinds of ways. But what I was trying to get to is that the notion of solidarity, um, in terms of where I grew up, Hawaii, right? Hawaii, was shaped both by culture as well as political exigency. All right, there was a need to overthrow a minority white government, and there was culture that was happening on the playgrounds, you know, in the lunchrooms, right, in the shipyards, in the fields, where people were learning to try to get along with each other, right? So we need the culture piece to be able to bind us together. We need the interlanguage, the pidgin English, right? We need the myths that people, the stories that people share with each other, the food that people share with each other, and it's at the same time we need to be able to find the political will to be able to imagine different ways of flexing power, and I think that that's the moment that we're in a large way and also in a community way in this particular moment. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from on a lot of these different types of questions.
Thank you, Jeff. And that perhaps kind of ties into my follow-up question to Kathy, which you actually already started talking a little bit about, right? The kind of vexed question about both inter, but also intra-racial solidarities. And you talk a little bit about that in Minor Feelings, right? That the Asian America as a political category has always been a tenuous alliance of more than 30 ethnic groups that might share what you call a vague purgatorial status or minor feelings as you term, being historically triangulated within the US racial order. Now, how do you think your work and or the work of literature, right, going to Jeff's point about myth-making and how myth has material ramifications, how do you think your work can help us think through then the politics of Asian America at this historical juncture, which we're also kind of stuck in a vague purgatorial status of a pandemic, of the rise in anti-Asian violence, but also high mobilization, and you kind of mentioned this earlier in your response, of Cold War rhetoric and trauma, which have united, but also fractured, right, many Asian American communities along generational, class, and ethnic lines.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just going to make this quick since I already talked. But I would say I don't. Again, there are 30 ethnicities, and as we've been talking repeatedly, there's also these fractures of class, gender, sexuality, and Asian Americans are clearly aware of that, so that whenever that term gets brought up, people are always, piling qualifiers upon that term. And it's like, sometimes I feel like Asian American is just qualifiers, just people being like, oh, well, it's not this or that. And I just think that one lesson that we can learn from our activist predecessors, and I'm talking about the UC Berkeley activists from 1968, is that when they came up with the term Asian American, it wasn't so much as a label as an aspiration. It was an identity that was oppositional, and it was a verb, right? And I think if we think of it that way, as like, well, what do we want? And everyone's going to obviously have different ideas, but like, if we think of Asian American as more of a loose alliance, who want a kind of belonging where there is equity among all races and not just Asian Americans, that may be a more flexible way in thinking about that. And if we think of Asian Americans as more of a allianceship, then it's easier to also imagine these kind of tributaries between other racial groups, and because obviously the term Asian American is going to be disaggregated and needs to be disaggregated at certain points. My own personal definition of Asian American, I can't speak for even people in this room, right? It's a radicalized vision that I have. It's oppositional. It's one that means ongoing struggle. And for me personally, that has its roots. And I think, again, I keep saying this, that has its roots to my family and my family's family, who come from South Korea and the division of Korea, and the kind of the protesters who were fighting, imperialism. That I feel a lot of connection to that, and I always think that there's a connection to what's happening here. But I guess that's. But everyone's going to have their own definition. But I think this battle as a writer, narrative is still very important in terms of decolonizing what a lot of Asian Americans think, from the Silicon Valley, the East Asians who are in Silicon Valley and who identify more with, Mark Zuckerberg than Yuri Kochiyama, to working class immigrants who are not interested in being part of or not interested in voting because they feel like it's not part of their that it's not part of their lives, or it's not going to make any, not going to matter. And I feel like that's the only way, because I'm a writer, and not, I mean, I'm an activist, but not an organizer. That's the only way I can contribute, is to help change the narrative and help change what American consciousness is.
Thank you, Kathy. And this perhaps ties into the second question to Nancy, and kind of Kathy's point about kind of what is the material work of narrative, right? That what is the material work, and this goes into Jeff's point, what is the material work of myth-making too? Does it have material ramifications? So this is where I turn to Nancy then. Do you see kind of material forms of work that can happen through representation? What does solidarity look like for you through representation? If you could speak a few words on that.
Yeah, so I think that representation matters. Not just like I don't see myself as someone on behalf of the Hollywood elite or even Hollywood actors, but really about how research shows that self-esteems of kids watching television, that kids of color and girls, like for every hour of television they watch, their self-esteems go down. So there are actual social, psychological ramifications for representation, right? Because unfortunately, that is what people do now, or I don't know, it's not unfortunately, but this is just the truth, that people consume a lot of media. This is what we do, right? And so this is the world that we live in. And because it's entertainment, people aren't really critically looking at it, right? And I feel like it's important for academics, for activists, for journalists to bring that out. And also when people don't have contact with certain groups of people, so if someone doesn't know any Asians in real life, their concepts of Asians come from the media, right? So then that's really dangerous, right? Especially if we're either invisible or we're only in subservient roles or villains. And so I think that grassroots and civil rights organizations have known this historically, right? We think about Birth of a Nation. The NAACP protested that because guess what? In that movie, the KKK were the heroes, right? And so we have to understand that representation in Hollywood does reflect the movement of society in terms of how it sees racial groups. And in 1996, even way before Oscar So White, Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition actually went and protested the Academy Awards, right? Because there were no motion pictures that had enough people of color. In 1999, there was actually a grand coalition that was formed with all these groups of color, like La Raza. There was a group called American Indians in Film. There was an Asian Pacific Media Coalition that was formed along with NAACP. And they ended up protesting the networks, the TV networks, because there were out of all the new shows that season, there were no people of color regulars, right? So it was a complete whiteout. And so they protested, and they ended up actually having meetings, and they wrote up MOUs, and the networks actually pledged to have diversity heads, so VPs. They pledged to have diversity initiatives and programs to recruit and retain people of color both behind and in front of the scenes. And those initiatives are actually still in place to this day, right? So it made a huge difference. And that's why we are seeing more representation than before. And I think that, and also academics have, since 2000, I've been doing this research, but UCLA, USC, they've all been coming out with reports and data. And I think that's what the role of academics to work together. I worked together on the first Asian American Pacific Islander television report, and that was with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, right? And I think the last report that I did with USC, we actually partnered with Amazon Studios and UTA Foundation. And I you can feel whatever you want about them, but the fact that there was money, there was support, and there was actually a desire within the industry to diversify. And then I think about how representation has become, or the media has become, church for people. With my students, it's a way to talk about racism that they can understand because everyone's watching the same thing or familiar, especially with Marvel kind of taking over. So we can talk about that. And it's an entryway for people to learn about racism, it's low stakes, right? So I think that when I talk about it, I feel like a lot of Asian Americans who maybe don't know Yuchi, who don't know our history, but they can talk about representation and they're excited and they want to kind of learn more. It's a way for me, I think, to kind of bring people in and then think about things critically, right? Media critically, and then that way to then challenge them to think more critically about other parts of society.
Thank you, Nancy. And this leads me to my my second question for Don Lien, is that as yourself, a culture creator, talk about the materiality of culture and an activist, what kind of work do you think the culture industry can play in these times, perhaps kind of responding to our conversation that Nancy is bringing up here? What is the work of storytelling in terms of rethinking or reshaping the presence and positionality of our relationships with each other in our cultural landscape?
All these questions. Whew, okay. So first of all, I love the the phrase "the culture industry." I think I'm someone who's always been actually quite uncomfortable with the entertainment industry because I actually didn't enter it to entertain people. It's just a part of what it means to be in front of people trying to have a conversation that matters to you through narrative. So like then you get the entertainment industry. But I want to say that my answer is actually going to respond all the way back to the conversation that we've been having since Jay brought up what I think are actually critical fissures, critical. And what I want to say is in terms of examples, right? And Nancy's been saying it, Kathy's been saying, in terms of examples, like, why haven't we seen examples for 50 years? There's a really big part that my culture industry / entertainment industry plays in that. Why haven't those been visible? Because I'm not going to believe that they're not there because I am that example. I know that they're there. Literally, my family's the example. It is the example. I didn't even know that I grew up with Emma and Yuji down the street. We would have dinner at their house like every other month. And that was a predominantly Black neighborhood. That's the example. And I didn't even know that they were the ones who coined the term Asian American until earlier this year, reading Viet Thanh Nguyen's op-ed in the New York Times. And I was like, Emma and Yuji, like I grew up with them. So that kind of like, none of that is hyper visible. None of it is barely visible, right? I'm part of how it becomes visible, but it's definitely there. It's the majority of my reality. And it's the majority of my family's reality. Like, it's not just me bridging my family. They bridge each other all the time. They literally seek each other out. They hang out with each other. I would say we spend the majority of our time with each other because we literally feel safest there, because we can acknowledge the complexity of all of our traumas. And at the end of the day, that's what I think my work is actually about. It's about naming and creating space to acknowledge the complexity of the traumas that we have been walking in this country for hundreds of years. And that what trauma does inevitably is isolate. Inevitably, that's what it does. So I feel like part of the lessons that I'm looking at for this moment of being a culture maker, of being someone who's both having the conversation through narrative work and seeking to have the conversation in other ways. That's part of what the Belong campaign has been about, is creating spaces to continually return to the discomfort, to actually get some tools to navigate the discomfort, have the conversations without kicking out any part of ourselves, even parts that are fighting with each other and feeling contradictory. They don't count. That's just how truth works. It's what I've learned as an artist. Truth does not involve one layer. It's just often it's multiple truths that are just true at the same time, and you have to embrace them and accept them. And how do we do that? Often it's through art. Often it's through narrative. Often it's through story. So that, for me, that's the lesson that I get from my family, is that we literally, quite literally, choose each other. We choose to stay in the room, and we choose it because we also quite literally love each other. And as much as love gets this sort of like woo-woo bad rap, I'm saying I've seen the most courageous things in my family from that place of love. And that's given that my mom, when she married my dad, understood that she was not going to be the one to lose face. Her parents would. Her Chinese parents and her Chinese community in Los Angeles would lose face, and they would lose their community, and they did. I never saw my grandparents with any friends. They lost it. They lost it. And so and yet my grandfather, who, you know, had the biggest issue, didn't go to their wedding, et cetera, loved us. So what does that, how do you put that together? How do you reconcile that? And for me, that's an example. It's not, I'm not naive enough to, I think I once was, but I'll never be naive enough to be like, and so racism doesn't it, you know, and so these, you know, there's no gap between these communities. That's quite literally why I do what I do, is because I live that truth in my family life, and I absolutely live it. I acknowledge and am pained by and am triggered by the truth of that gap in our larger society. And that's what has me committed to staying in the room and staying in the conversation and insisting on the conversation. And I think that is the responsibility that maybe all of us here have, is insisting that the conversation be centered, insisting that our lenses be centered, insisting that all parts of it be included, and that those who are uncomfortable, who don't either normalize it or share the culture or whatever it is, they stay in the room too, and they deal with the discomfort too. So that's where I am with most of it. The last thing I want to say is I really do feel that getting to know and working to, I don't know if expose is the right way, or make visible the history of violence and bloodshed in Asian communities, and as a part of like that, I think is deeply tied to how we are individually willing to center what our own racialized traumas have been in our lives. Like it comes from that to me. That's what I feel like I had to confront recently as a culture maker, is that what part of me made it okay to make myself invisible? What part of me made it okay to make my Asian identity invisible? What part of me made it okay I just feel that there is a courage of being in these positions of speaking and naming and creating definitions and conversations around this, to be just courageous in your own personal journey, and in naming that and talking about it, and not being detached from it. And that's part of my work too. And I consider that work. I consider that a part of my work.
So in setting up the final question, and I know we're at time, but if folks can bear with us for a few more minutes, for a final question that gets into the concrete, gets into this notion that solidarity is a verb and not a noun, as Jeff reminded us. You know, one of the things that is apparent to me in hearing Nancy and Dawn Lien speak about culture is that, you know, that terrain is not just an accessible one where we begin to have an intro conversation with people about racism. It actually is, I think, a profound one, and one that it endures in movements. And the example I can probably best give is that the modern white supremacist movement, the modern white power movement, fed vitally off of a genre of Vietnam War films during the 1980s, in which it familiarized the public with the figure of a white male victim who committed violence against people of color. As he was committing violence, he was the traumatized victim. And this is what you see on full display on January 6th at the Capitol. So the notion that, you know, there's culture and then there's like, you know, the real organizing on the ground, and the two are kind of two separate conversations. I'm not saying anyone was creating that, you know, binary, but to the extent that might be introduced in the conversation, we need to correct that, because it's so clear how culture does animate movements on the ground. But let's end on this question of movements on the ground. What are some key things that we might pay attention to now that are good examples of solidarity, right? Even if no one's paying attention, even if they're still far away from where the public conversation is. And I'm going to throw that question out to Jeff to start. And if other folks want to hit on it before we close, feel free to do so.
I'll start really quick, but first I just want to say this conversation has been really profound, and I'm just really I'm thankful to Jay for asking the really hard questions. I'm really thankful, Kathy and Don, for reminding us the reason we're actually even all here, right, is war, and the trauma echoes down the generations, and that's it. We have to deal with it on a personal level, and we also have to figure out a way to feel our way, I guess, towards mending the historical trauma that prevents us from being able to find community. And so the thing that I wanted to maybe build on from Don's thing, just your note about like growing up next to Emma and Yuji is just, it's powerful. I grew up, I'm over here down the street from where Maury Turner used to live, the first syndicated Black cartoonist who helped shape my world when I was a baby, with practically a kid, in the library trying to find a comic book that there could be an Asian in, and then shape my adult life by being one of my most profound influences. And he's a neighbor. And it just reminds me that, as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we live in a real segregated country. Whites are the most segregated from every other racial group. And Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are the least. And so the strange thing about our in-betweenness is that it could be a superpower to, we have to make choices about how we want to move forward. We have a really crucial role to play in shaping what the next century is going to look like in this country and around the world. And I think that our engagement in our communities, right, because we're in schools and at work with other racial groups more than other racial groups are with other racial groups, right? That's part of what we existentially kind of have to look at and confront and figure out our way through and come together around. I mean, if the whole notion of Asian America was an act of solidarity and a fiction and a myth that we had to build out, right? Like, what can we offer to the next century of the myths that we can build out for that? And I wasn't meaning to suggest earlier that Hawaii is the model, not at all, right? But to say that we have instances, and I think this is what you all are talking about, where we can talk about, like, this happened, this worked, these things happened on a little, sort of neighbor to neighbor type of basis, and they added up because we showed up for each other and we figured out, like, our destinies were tied together and we needed to figure it out together.
Thank you. And with that, actually, we are kind of beyond our allotted time. Thank you, audience, for your questions, even though we weren't able to address them live today because of the robust conversation. They will be sent along to the panelists and will help shape our thinking of this conversation later as it's edited and published in Journal of Asian American Studies. We thank you all for joining, and we hope this panel opens up further conversations. Thank you all, and good night.